Hi, so we're ready to look at section 1.5 titled Bias and Sampling. So what we want to be able to do is be able to explain the sources of bias and sampling by the end of this lesson. So just to remind you of the goal of sampling, right? The goal of sampling is to obtain information about a population through a sample. Right, so we get a sample and try to find out what's going on in the population, right? And so far we've talked about some sampling methods and some things, but we haven't maybe talked about some of the problems that can arise by doing a sample. So that's what this section is going to cover. So then if the results of the sample are not representative of the population, then the sample has what we call bias. Right? So there are really three sources of bias in sampling. We can have sampling bias, non-response bias, and also response bias. So let's go over what each of those mean. So the first one is sampling bias. So sampling bias means that the technique that you use to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. Right? So the methods that you're doing, it's not really representative of everyone in the population. Right? So that's why randomness is important there. Any convenience sample that you're going to do is going to have some kind of sampling bias because the individuals are not chosen at random, right? So that's important to note. So then the next thing we want to talk about is undercoverage. Right. So undercoverage results in sampling bias, and undercoverage occurs when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in a sample than it is in the population, right? So maybe, if I give you an example, let's say there are 65% of Marian Tech students are female, but if you do a survey and you get a sample, and let's say only, I don't know, 40% female respond to your survey and 60% are male, then that obviously could have some kind of sampling bias, and there would be some undercoverage in the female population then, right? So that's just one quick example that comes to mind. Right? And there's some examples in the text in this section to read over about sampling bias. So if you read over that, if you remember, one example was using the Literacy Digest to predict the 1936 presidential election. So that was Roosevelt versus Landon. And the Literacy Digest, they pulled their subscribers. They went through a telephone directory and also pulled the automobile owners, and that's how they, built their list. And it turns out that there was some sampling bias there because during that time period, the people that were subscribers to Literacy Digest and also owned a telephone and owned an automobile were typically of the Republican Party, so they tended to vote for Landon, who was a Republican candidate. So that just had some sampling bias in that, right? So the techniques that we use, that technique tend to favor Republicans over Democrats. So that impacted the results of the study. Another thing to think about is telephone surveys are pretty popular. You probably get maybe a lot of calls, especially if you're a registered voter. During an election year, a primary election year, you might get a lot of phone calls trying to do surveys. But something to keep in mind there is it doesn't count in those that maybe don't own a phone and the homeless, right? So certainly there's a lot of people who do own a phone, um, but it doesn't allow for those people to be in the survey at all, right? So there's definitely some bias there. All right, so then the next fill in the blank I have here is frames. So remember, a frame is a list of all individuals in the population, and sometimes we can get those, and sometimes they're not easy to obtain. But even if it's easy to attain, like for example, if I wanted to have a list of all registered voters in Ohio, theoretically I could get that list, if I worked or, had the rights to get that list, I could get that list. But then something to keep in mind is why it's difficult is the frame is a snapshot in time, right? That actual list is going to change. So if I ask for the frame today, right now, and then I'm planning out my survey, and maybe, I can't get to doing the survey for another week, then, I've already lost, and that list is not up to date, because some people probably registered to vote in that time. So frames are hard because they're not fixed, they're static, right? They can change. So then the second item from the list was non-response bias, right? So that's the next thing we want to define, right? So non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who do. Non-response can be improved through the use of callbacks or rewards/incentives, right? So in other words, the people that aren't responding, that could impact our survey because, maybe a particular group that feels a certain way chooses not to respond, and so we're not able to capture that viewpoint, capture that data from those. That's not going to be in our sample. So an example from that in the book is it talked about in the Literacy Digest that when they were estimating or doing that poll for the presidential election in 1936, they sent out more than 10 million questionnaires, and then they only received 2.3 million back. So if you take 2.3 million and divide it by 10 million, you're going to get, so this is equal to 0.23, which is 23%. Okay. So then I have a list here of how to improve non-response bias. So number one, we can try surveying again. So try surveying again. And if you try surveying again, I would recommend, doing a different method. And then also, maybe you could change up the time. Right, so for example, let's say, I don't know, you tried a survey by calling individuals maybe on Monday at 8 a.m. and you didn't get a lot of didn't get a good response from that survey. You might try, changing the method. Maybe you try emailing, or maybe you try calling on a Tuesday night at, like 7 p.m. or something, right? So you kind of change it up, trying to gather more information, right? Also, changing your method and your time could just help you get a better pool of different kinds of individuals, right? So, for example, if we do email versus calling versus in person, some groups of people respond better to different things, right? So, um, like if a survey was sent to my mom by email, she probably wouldn't answer that, right? Where if I got a survey by email, I would be more tempted, right? I'm a little more tech savvy, so forth. Um, so then another way to improve non-response bias is to offer an incentive. Right, and this could be money. So I'll give you $1 if you answer my survey, or $10. Maybe it's a drawing. Right, so if you answer this survey, we will enter you in a drawing for an iPad or something, right? So trying to make it worth people's time. Some people might give you a small gift card. If you fill out the survey, we'll give you a $5 gift card to Amazon or something like that, right? So those are all kind of things. So you just offer some kind of incentive. Every person maybe gets a gift, or maybe you're putting them in a drawing, can help get responses. The third thing is you can try to explain how information can be used. Right? So, for example, if I was trying to do a survey on campus for, let's say, trying to get like a dining hall or some kind of food service on campus, if I was doing a survey on that, it might be helpful for me to explain and tell students, like, hey, we're trying to gather information and see about the possibility of adding a food service on campus, and that might get people more engaged if they know where how the information is being used, right? If they think it's basically worth their time to fill out the survey. So that's kind of an incentive as well, right? So sometimes you might get a cover letter or something in the survey if it's mailed out or emailed out or something that kind of explains that. Right? You don't have to go in specifics. Tell everyone all the specifics, but just tell them enough to get them interested in why they should spend time to do the survey. So then the third type of bias is response bias, right? So that's here. So response bias exists when the answer on a survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent, right? So types of response bias are interviewer error, misrepresented answers, wording of questions, order of questions or words. So in other words, if I want to, basically the data is not capturing what the person really wants to say, right, if you will, or what the real answer is. So the first one to look at, interview error, just some notes on that, is that it's important to use, so you need a trained third-party interviewer. Right, that would be the best case scenario. So having some training is good, because a good interviewer can elect responses and make them feel comfortable to give truthful responses. right? So that's why you want someone that's trained so they can do that effectively. But also, why do you want a third party interviewer? So let's say I worked for, I don't know, like a car company, car salesman company, um, or really any company, right? And I'm trying to sell a product, and I have one of my employees do do these interviews, and I report that 90%, 95% of the people who buy my product recommend this product to others, or something of that sort. So, it's good to have a third party that doesn't really have an interest in the results of the survey for obvious reasons, right? We don't want to have um, that kind of interview error either, where the interviewer is just kind of not listening, or kind of not being truthful in what they are capturing. So another one to look at is misrepresented answers. So in general, naturally, people will inflate things or underreport things. So, for example, if I asked everyone's salary right now, typically people will inflate. So people. Oops, sorry. It's not wanting to let me draw. Hang on. All right, so sorry, my drawing monitor is not working right at the moment to write these answers down. So I'm just going to type them. It's probably be easier to read anyway. So we are on misinterpreted answers. So as I was saying, oftentimes people will inflate their salaries, right? So if I did a survey, asked you to tell me what your salary was, typically you don't know your salary to the penny, for one, and also a lot of people like to inflate those to sound better, right? Or they make more money because apparently, that's better. Another thing that people will also underreport items. So, for example, if I ask someone their weight, and if they're self-conscious about that, they would probably underreport that. So underreport your weight, right, is one example. And also, some people will overestimate their abilities, right? So I don't know, if I asked you how many I don't know how many push-ups you can do in a minute, how fast can you run a mile, I don't know, just those kind of like things that people like to brag about. I think just have pressures to answer things a certain way, but they might not be truthful, right? And that causes bias. It's misrepresented answers. Right, so then the next item, 3, is looking at wording of questions. So some things to keep in mind is that we need neutral and balanced questions, right? So, for example, how you word a question can influence how someone answers the question. Like if you, I don't know, said like, I'm against people who receive speeding tickets. Have you received a speeding ticket, or something like that? They need to be very neutral, so that you don't know what position or what side of something you're on, and also it gives like an equal weight, like equal balance to both options, right? So it's better to avoid like no yes answers, like I don't know, like have you ever received a speeding ticket? It might be better to ask like how many speeding tickets have you received in the past year or your entire driving career, those kind of things, right? So you want to have a neutral and balanced question, because the wording can persuade people to answer a certain way, right? So wording can persuade people to answer a certain way. Right. So something else to keep in mind is the ordering of questions and also the ordering of words. So the order of questions and words and choices can impact the answers chosen. So for example, people tend to choose earlier choices. Right? So, if you give like a multiple choice question like A through E, it's good to mix up those options because some people might, just, tend to choose like A and B over D and E because they appear earlier, right? For multiple reasons. Maybe they're not reading the whole thing. They're just kind of skimming like, oh, that answer sounds right. They don't even read the others. Also, depending on how a question's worded, it could influence your answer to another question, right? So maybe, you've taken an exam before, you read one question and then you read another question, and from reading that second question, you change your answer to the first question, right? So things of that sort could also impact this. So if you mix the order of the questions and also the order of the words, it kind of balances out those issues. So then the type of question also plays into this. So we have really two types of questions. We can have an open question. Which an open question will allow the respondent to choose his or her response, right? So think like an essay question, right? Where a closed question, the respondent chooses from a predetermined list of responses, right? Think like multiple choice test, right? Or question. Right, so that'll help you remember the difference between those two. So some things to keep in mind with an open question is that there are, typically going to be too many different possible answers, right? So that's maybe a con of an open question. Maybe you get a whole bunch of different answers. But something to keep in mind with a closed question is that you're forced to pick a choice even if it isn't your choice, right? So in other words, you kind of like settle for a choice and the best choice, but the choice you pick might not actually fully answer the question how you would like, right? So a recommendation for closed questions is to first do a pre-survey with open questions to obtain the most popular choices. Right? So basically a recommendation is do a pre-survey with some people and make them open questions so you can gather what they want to say or write about that, and then you can use those results to pick out what your choices should be, right? Maybe you think of choices, maybe you come across choices that you didn't consider before. Right. So then the last thing on this page, and it's not necessarily a not technically a response bias, but it's definitely can impact the responses, is what we call data entry error. Right? And you can try to minimize data entry error by having some kind of electronic um, survey. Even then it could still happen. Like if someone is cleaning up results, they could make an error. But basically, data entry error is when you're doing something on paper, and then typically, we want that to be into a computer program somehow. And a common one is where people impose numbers. So there's an example here that maybe instead of writing 39, someone writes 93. All those kind of things could happen. Right. All right. So looking at the next page, something that's important to note and think about is that a census can still have bias, right? We've really been talking about samples here, but we've talked about before how a census, theoretically would be, measuring everyone in the population, but that's not really possible. So even a census, is gonna be a sample, regardless, just a really big sample, if you will. But there's gonna be some response bias, right? So for example, you could have some confusing questions on a census. Also, you can also have non-response bias. So like problem with not being able to include the homeless in a census. So I'm thinking specifically about the U.S. Census, but it could be any census. Right. So now what I want to do is define two types of errors that occur in sampling. So the first one is called non-sampling errors. Right, so non-sampling errors are errors that result from sampling bias, non-response bias, or data entry error, and such errors could also be present in a complete census of the population. Right? So then the next set of error is called sampling error. Oops. Right? And that's an error that results from using a sample to estimate information about a population. This type of error occurs because a sample gives incomplete information about a population, right? So naturally, this idea about having a population and taking a sample to try to find information about the population, naturally, the sampling error is going to occur no matter what, right? So it's impossible to not have sampling error. So I have here errors in sampling. I wrote these definitions maybe a little easier, shorter, to help you remember them. So sampling errors, they're the inherent error from using a sample to estimate the population, right? So it's just something that naturally is going to occur because we don't have everyone in the population. Non-sampling errors are errors that result from the survey process. Right? So, one way to calculate the error is we can take the statistic minus the parameter. So, statistic, remember, is a measurement from the sample, and the parameter is a measurement from the population, right? So, we'll look at this in example 1. So, let's say that you want to estimate the average starting salary for recent nursing graduates from Marian Technical College. The recent graduating class had 40 graduates. You conducted a simple random sample to select 8 students and found the average salary to be $59,052. Right? So in other words here, the population is the 40 recent RN graduates. Right. So the sampling error. Right. Oh, and well, let's read. I didn't read part A, but part A, we're assuming that all the respondents told the truth. They answered their exact salary. They understood the questions and the sampling methods were done correctly. So what's the sampling error? If you know the true average starting salary for the recent 40 nursing graduates is $53,715, right? So the sampling error would be equal to, so we take the statistic, so the measurement from the sample, so that would be the 59,000, right? Because that's from $59,052. That's from 8 people, right? A subset of the population. That's the sample. And then we subtract the parameter, which is the value from the population. So that's the 53,715 number. And we can get a solution. And I just hit equals in space, and OneNote gave me that solution for me really easily, right? But, you know, another way you could get that answer is use a calculator. And I'm just going to pull up R and show you how to do some arithmetic and R just to get you comfortable with R, because we're going to be using it a lot. So all I did was change the text size, made it larger for you to be able to see. So I can just type 59052 minus 53715, right? Just how you would type like in your computer calculator. I hit enter and it spits out the answer, right? So you can use R to do some basic arithmetic, right? So I've often used R to do some basic arithmetic, like balance my checkbook, and my family thinks that's funny, but yeah. So $5,337 is the sampling error here, right? So that's the difference between what we got from the sample and what's going on, right? So there's some error involved by sampling instead of just doing like a census, right? Like knowing what every single person is making. And then just to help you understand the difference between sampling and non-sampling error, right? So this occurred just from having a sample. Everything was done correctly, but we still have some error. So then what type of error, though, would occur if one of the 8 students lied about his salary, right? That would be an example of non-sampling error. Right. So it doesn't like that. I'm just going to put maybe a hyphen, non-sampling error. Let's put a hyphen there. Right. For some reason, it doesn't like that. I think the book spells it non-sampling with no hyphen and all one, non-sampling being all one word, but Microsoft doesn't seem to like that. Right. So the idea here is that this error from the lying is resulting not from the sampling, it's resulting from the survey process. Right. All right, so now I have some examples to go through with you. So I have 5 examples. Example 5 has a few parts. So example 2 is, so these are giving us a scenario that has bias. We want to determine the type of bias and then suggest how they could fix it, right? A remedy. So example 2, the village of Oakland wishes to conduct a study regarding the income level of household within the village. The village manager selects 10 homes in the southwest corner of the village and sends an interviewer to the homes to determine the household income, right? So something that should stick out to you, so part A is that this would be sampling bias, right? And that's because the homes in the southwest corner may have different demographics than others in the village. Right? So it's maybe not a good sample, right? So there could be some potentially bias there. A remedy would be you could use a simple random sampling, or you could do cluster sampling with maybe city blocks as the clusters, right? Either one of those, right? And we've talked about those sampling methods, but using one of those sampling methods I think makes sense. And naturally, when you're, it's very classic example of cluster sampling is where you have things split up in city blocks, right? So example 3 deals with Cold Stone Creamery. So Cold Stone Creamery is considering opening a new store in O'Fallon. Before opening, the company wants to know the percentage of households in O'Fallon that regularly visit an ice cream shop. The market researcher obtains a list of households in O'Fallon. They randomly select 150 and mail a questionnaire that asks about ice cream heating habits and flavor preferences, right? So sounds good so far. Of the 150 questionnaires mailed, 4 are returned. Right, so that's not a very good response rate, right? 4 out of 150, that's a really small value, right? Like if I come over here to R, 4 divided by 150 is, that's less than 3%, right? That's really low number. So part A, this would be non-response bias. So that's because it has a very low response rate, right? Less than 3% is what we found. So then part B, a possible remedy, is they could try sampling again with a different method time, right? So another thing is they could try offering an incentive. Another thing they might consider is when they switch the method, maybe do face-to-face interviews with a trained interviewer, right? So those are all possible remedies. Example 4 says determine the public opinion of the police department. The police chief obtains a cluster sample of 15 census tracts within his jurisdiction and samples all households in the randomly selected tracts. Uniformed police officers go door to door to conduct the survey, right? So something that should be sticking out to you is they're asking about your opinion about police officers, but the people that are doing the survey are uniformed police officers, right? So naturally, as you could imagine, that's going to create some bias, right? People, probably aren't going to answer very truthfully, honestly, might be, so there's going to be some response bias here. So respondents aren't likely to give truthful responses. Possible remedy is to use a trained interviewer. All right, so then example 5, I have a couple of parts here. This first question says, discuss the benefits of having trained interviewers. Right? So I would say you're going to have better survey results. Trained interviewers can elicit responses. Whoops. I think that's right. Can elicit responses. I think it's ELICT. Hang on one second. Nope, that's right. Microsoft is right. I won't argue with them. All right, so interviewers can elicit responses to difficult questions. All right, so in other words, if there's a really difficult question to answer, or maybe people are uncomfortable answering, if you have a good trained interviewer, they might be able to get answers for that. Right? So those are some benefits. So the next question is discuss the pros and cons of telephone interviews that take place during dinner time in the early evening. So we want some pros. I'll give one pro and one con. How about that? So one pro is that there's a higher chance of making contact with individuals, right? If you're calling early evening during dinner time, it's a good chance to catch people. People probably home, got home from work, visiting with their family, and getting ready to have dinner. But a con is that people may get upset about being interrupted during dinner. Oops. Right, so some people might not get angry, but I think a lot of people would, right? Like, why are you bothering me? I'm trying to enjoy dinner with my family. All right, so the next is, why is a high response rate desired? How would a low response rate affect the results, right? So we're going to get better survey results with a high response rate. A low response rate may mean that segments of the population are underrepresented, or that only individuals with strong opinions have participated. Right, so that's always a concern if you have low responses. It might indicate that only people that have really strong opinions, like for or against, responded. You don't have a lot of that middle ground. Right, so those are all things to consider. And also we might have some underrepresentation going on, right? The last thing is discuss why the order of questions or choices within a questionnaire are important in sample surveys. So changing the order helps prevent bias due to previous question answers or situations where respondents are more likely more likely to pick earlier choices. Right. All right, so that finishes this section. So highly suggest you read over that section if you need some more help, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.